Hello students, welcome to the EPG Pathshala. I am Professor Richa Tanwar from the Women's Studies Research Center, Kurukshetra University. Today, I am going to talk about women and Hinduism from the paper Women and Religion. The objectives of this module are to make the reader understand the status of women in the Hindu religion with reference to different periods of ancient history. According to A.S. Altekar, women once enjoyed considerable freedom and privileges in the sphere of family, religion, and public life. But as centuries rolled on, the situation went on changing adversely. On the other hand, the proprietary rights went on gradually expanding in spite of the growing tendency to regard women as unfit for independent life. According to Uma Chakravarti and other historians, since the traditional work on the status of women in India exists entirely within the context of Hinduism, it is heavily preoccupied with religious and legal questions such as the right to widow remarriage, the existence of the institution of Niyog, the right to property for women, the origin and development of the institution of Istridhan, the right of the childless widow to adopt, and so on. It is further observed that another feature of this traditional writing on the position of women is that they are based entirely on Brahmanical sources. Even if these sources are considered to be reasonably authentic, they carry the problem of an inherent bias of the Brahmanas, reflecting the percepts of the Brahmanas rather than the actual practice of the people, and finally, confining themselves to the upper castes. On the whole, the perspective of women is confined to seeing them within the context of the family. It is the status of women within the family and primarily in the relationship of wives to husbands with which the traditional writers have been concerned. The best known and internally coherent nationalist work on women is Altekar's study on the position of women in Hindu civilization. His work is based primarily on Brahmanical sources and outlines the position of women from earliest times right up to the mid-50s of this century, when the Hindu Code Bill was passed under consideration in the 20th century. Altekar's work represents the best that is available to us by way of women's studies in history. But it also shows up very sharply the limitations of the traditional approach. Although the work unravels in detail the entire body of opinion of the lawmakers on areas as the education of women, marriage, divorce, the position of the widows, women in public life, proprietary rights of women, and the general position of women in society, it is steeped in the nationalist understanding of the women's question. Further, his overwhelming concern is with women in the context of family, and one almost gets the feeling that the status of women needs to be raised in order to ensure the healthy development of the future race of India. In this, he was reflecting the opinion of nationalist writers from the second half of the 19th century, who placed tremendous importance on the physical regeneration of the Hindus. It will be convenient to divide the period we have to survey into 4 divisions. 1. The age of the Rig Veda from 2500 to 1500 BC. 2nd. The age of the later Samhitas, Brahmanas, and Upanishads from 1500 BC to 500 BC. The age of the Sutras, epics, and early Smritis from 500 BC to AD 500. And the age of the later Smritis, commentators and digest writers from AD 500 to AD 1800. The Rig Vedic age, that is 2500 BC to 1500 BC. The position which women occupied in Hindu society at the dawn of civilization during the Vedic age is much better than what we ordinarily expected to have been. There are no doubt there are a few indications to show that brides were sometimes sold in marriage or even carried away by force. But the better conscience of society had already begun to assert itself and condemn those practices as unholy and unworthy. The ideal marriage of the Vedic period was a religious sacrament which made the couple joint owners of the household. The old tradition that the wife was the property of the husband had not yet completely died down. The hymn about the famous gambling in the Rig Veda shows that sometimes confirmed gamblers would stake away their wives to their opponents. The advice given to the gambler in this hymn was, however, it shows that the social conscience had already begun to disapprove this practice. Ordinarily, girls were no doubt less welcome than boys. But one must add that there were also some parents in society who would perform special religious rituals for the good luck of getting learned and capable daughters. Girls were educated like boys and had to pass through a period of brahmacharya. Many of them used to become distinguished poetesses, and the poems of some of them have been honored by their inclusion in the canonical literature. The marriages of girls used to take place at a fairly advanced age, the normal age being the age of 16 or 17. In social and religious gatherings, they occupied a prominent position. Women had an absolute equality with men in the eye of religion. They could perform sacrifices independently and were not regarded as an impediment in religious pursuits. Marriage, in fact, was a religious necessity to both the man and the woman, and neither could reach heaven without being accompanied by his duly married consort. The position of the wife was an honored one in the family. In theory, she was the joint owner of the husband with her household, although in actual practice, she was the subordinate partner. In rich and royal families, polygamy prevailed to some extent, but ordinarily, monogamy was the rule. If a wife had the misfortune to be widowed, she had not to ascend her husband's funeral pyre. That is, sati was not practiced. The sati custom was not in vogue at all. The widow could, if she liked, contract another marriage, either regularly or under the custom of niyog. The main disabilities from which women suffered in this age, as well as the next one, were proprietary ones. They could hold or inherit no property. The transition from the communal to the family ownership of land was just taking place. The conception of the rights of the different members of the family, even when males, was yet to crystallize. Naturally, therefore, women, like many other male members of the family, were incapable of owning property. The patriarch was its sole owner and guardian. From the internal evidence of the Rig Veda, it appears that the concept of individual ownership was not prevalent in the early Vedic age. Reference to commonwealth or collective ownership are found abundantly in the Rig Veda. Tribal bond of kinship was an essential feature of the early Vedic society, and as such, tribal wealth was divided among the constituent clans and subclans. This is attested by the passing passages referring to Varya and Bhaga, which were the Rig Vedic terms of division. Land was not any form of property in the early Vedic age because agriculture was then hardly known. Even when agriculture was introduced in later Vedic age, land was subject to joint or corporate holding, so the question of individual ownership and inheritance of land could not arise at all. Evidences of some kind of individual possession is found in the later books of the Rig Veda. That in the later period of the Rig Veda, even women were entitled to have some share of cattle wealth as marriage gift is suggested in the wedding hymn. The term mentioned here is Vahatu, which has been explained by Sayana as cow and other gifts given for pleasing the girl. Needless to say that the Vedic society, owing to its pastoral background, was essentially patriarchal, which is attested by the abundance of misogynistic passages in the Vedic texts. Example, in the Satapatha Brahman, it is stated that women own neither themselves nor an inheritance. Yaska in his Nirukta says that women are not entitled to partition and inheritance. But whatever was the attitude towards women, it was not possible in practice to suppress all their property rights, especially owing to the fact that there were parallel traditions everywhere which could not be ignored by the Vedic lawgivers. The term parinaya has been used in the Tatirya Samhita, indicating the authority of the wife on family resources. This reoccurs in the Purva Minimum Sasutra of Gemini, which has been explained by Sabara in terms of possessing certain forms of property by the wife, and almost in the same sense the term has been used by Manu. It should, however, be stressed that although the concepts of property and division are found in the Vedic texts, especially the later ones, in that formative period of economic life, there was a natural contradiction between the social and individual ownership. The Dharam Sutras are openly in favor of an extremely patrilineal form of inheritance, in which, in the absence of sons, the property will rather go to the near and remote agnates of the property holder, who are male, than to his own daughters. The age of the later Samhitas, Brahmanas and Upanishads, that is from 1500 BC to 500 BC. The change which took place during this period in the position of women was gradual. Their proprietary rights continued to be unrecognized, the only exception being in favor of marriage gifts of movable property. In the higher sections of society, the sacred initiation of girls was common, Upnayana, and they subsequently used to go through a course of education. Some of them used to attain distinction in the realm of theology and philosophy, and a considerable number of women used to follow the teaching career. There was, however, a gradual decline in female education as the period advanced. The system of sending out girls to famous teachers or centers of education came to be discouraged. It was laid down that only near relations like the father, the brother, or the uncle should teach them at home. Naturally, therefore, religious and secular training became possible only in the case of girls of the rich and cultured families. As a consequence, there arose a tendency to curtail the religious rights and privileges of the average woman, and in many functions in the sacrifice, which formerly could be performed by the wife alone, now came to be assigned to male substitutes. In cultured families, women used to recite their Vedic prayers every morning and evening and perform sacrifices on their husband's behalf when they were otherwise preoccupied. The marriage age of the bride continued to be about 16. In practice, if not in theory, brides had some voice in the selection of their partners in life, and Swamvar was fairly common in Kshatriya circles. The marriage ideals and the mutual relations and rights of the parties continued to be more or less the same as they were in the earlier age. Divorce was permitted to the wife, though the permission was not extensively availed of. The sati custom was altogether unknown, and the widow had the option of remarriage either with her brother-in-law or with an outsider. Naturally, there was no tonsure of widows. Parda was altogether unknown, but women had ceased to attend public meetings. It would appear that the general freedom and better status which women enjoyed in the Vedic age were largely due to men being engrossed in the work of conquest and consolidation. Women used to take an active part in agriculture and the manufacture of cloth, bows, arrows, and other war material. They were thus useful members of society. Another factor responsible for the relatively satisfactory position of women was the influence of religion. Asceticism was at a discount in the Vedic age. Maidens and bachelors had no admission to heaven. Gods accepted no oblations offered by the unmarried. It was essential to offer the ordained sacrifices to gods for procuring happiness and prosperity, both here and hereafter, and they could be properly performed by the husband and the wife officiating together. The wife was not an impediment, but an absolute necessity in the religious service. This circumstance naturally helped to raise her status. To enable her to discharge her religious duties properly, it was necessary to ordain that her Upnayan ceremony should be duly performed. This ensured a proper training and education to girls. The age of the sutras, epics, and early smritis, that is from 500 BC to AD 500. The position of women deteriorated considerably in this period. Some centuries before the beginning of this period, the Aryan rule had become well established over the greater part of India. The Aryan conquest of the indigenous population and its loose incorporation in the social structure of the victors as members of the fourth Sudra class had given rise to a huge population of a semi-service status. Women, however, did not suffer merely because they ceased to be productive members of society. The introduction of the non-Aryan wife into the Aryan household was the key to the general deterioration of the position of women, that gradually and imperceptibly started at about 1000 BC, became quite marked in about 500 years. The non-Aryan wife, with her ignorance of Sanskrit language and Hindu religion, could obviously not enjoy the same religious privileges as the Aryan consort. Association with her must have tended to affect the purity of speech of the Aryan co-wife as well. Very often, the non-Aryan wife may have been the favorite one of her husband, who may have often attempted to associate her with his religious sacrifices in preference to her better educated but less loved Aryan co-wife. Very often, the non-Aryan wife may have been the favorite one of her husband, who may have often attempted to associate her with his religious sacrifices in preference to her better educated but less loved Aryan co-wife. This must have naturally led to grave mistakes and anomalies in the performance of the ritual, which must have shocked Orthodox priests. The first remedy they must have thought was to declare the non-Aryan wife to be unfit for association with her husband in religious rituals. The black non-Aryan wife may be her husband's associate in pleasure, but not in religious rituals, say several authorities. But a mighty king, maddened with love for his non-Aryan beloved, was not to be dictated by the priesthood dependent upon him for its subsistence. He would insist upon having his own favorite wife by his side at the time of his sacrifices, no matter what her race or caste. How then was the situation to be retrieved? Eventually, it was felt that the object could be gained by declaring the whole class of women to be ineligible for Vedic studies and religious duties. There would then be no question of rejecting admission to non-Aryan wife and granting it to an Aryan one. All women would be ineligible and none need be offended. It is Eti Satyasayan who is seen advocating this view by about 200 BC. The growing complexity of the Vedic sacrifice was another factor that tended to make the wife's association in religious rituals a more and more formal affair in course of time. It required a long training to get the necessary capacity to follow intelligently the minute details of the complicated sacrifice, and the average woman had not so much time to devote for the purpose. It is Etisayan who is seen advocating this view by about 200 BC. The growing complexity of the Vedic sacrifice was another factor that tended to make the wife's association in religious rituals a more and more formal affair in course of time. It required a long training to get the necessary capacity to follow intelligently the minute details of the complicated sacrifice, and the average woman had not so much time to devote for the purpose. Owing to the different causes narrated above, at the beginning of this period there arose a tendency to lower the marriageable age of girls and as a consequence to discourage their upnayan and education. It was emphasized that it would be advisable to get them married soon after the attainment of puberty. The view that women should not be allowed to participate in sacrifices was no doubt not accepted by society, but its vigorous advocacy by one school, along with the general lowering of the marriage age, tended to a growing and inevitable neglect of the Vedic education of girls. During the first half of this period, a few maidens continued to specialize in Vedic studies and rituals, but the majority of girls used to go merely through the formality of Upanayan just before the celebration of their marriage. It was declared that marriage was the substitute for Upanayan in the case of girls. They need not have any separate sacred initiation. Upanayan was usually performed at about the age of 9 or 10, and the same age now came to be regarded as the ideal time for marriage of girls. Towards the end of this period, that is AD 500, parents could not usually keep their daughters unmarried after the age of 12. Discontinuance of the Upanayan, the neglect of education, and the lowering of the marriage age produced disastrous consequences upon the position and status of women. Early marriage put an effective impediment in the higher education of girls. Brides, being too young and inexperienced, ceased to have any effective voice in the settlement of their marriages. Swayamvar, however, continued to be in vogue in Kshatriya circles, but it came to be condemned by Brahmanical writers. Early marriage put an effective impediment in the higher education of girls. Brides, being too young and inexperienced, ceased to have any effective voice in the settlement of their marriages. Swayamvar, however, continued to be in vogue in Kshatriya circles, but it came to be condemned by Brahmanical writers. Marriage was regarded as a religious sacrament in the Vedic period also, and yet society was permitting divorce and remarriage in exceptional cases. During the period under review, marriage became an irrevocable union, irrevocable, however, only so far as the wife was concerned. The husband could discard his wife for the grave offense of not being sufficiently submissive. Wife, however, could not take a similar step and marry a second time, even if her husband had taken to vicious ways and completely abandoned her. This differential treatment was due to the simple fact that women were no longer able to effectively oppose these absurd theories and claims, most of them being uneducated and quite ignorant of their former status and privileges. The period of 500 years between 200 BC and AD 300 was a very dark and dismal one for northern India. The fertile plains of the Punjab and the Gangetic Valley were subjected during this period to one foreign invasion after another. First came the Greeks, who under Demetrius and Menander, 190 to 150 BC, were able to penetrate right up to Patna in Bihar. Then came the Scythians and the Parthians, 100 BC to AD 50, whose frightful wars of conquest reduced Hindu population by one half, 25% being killed and 25% being enslaved and carried away. These barbarians were followed by the Kusanas, who succeeded in overrunning practically the whole of northern India by the middle of the 2nd century AD. Then came the Scythians and the Parthians, 100 BC to AD 50, whose frightful wars of conquest reduced Hindu population by one half, 25% being killed and 25% being enslaved and carried away. These barbarians were followed by the Kusanas, who succeeded in overrunning practically the whole of northern India by the middle of the 2nd century AD. Political reverses, war atrocities, and the decline of population and prosperity naturally produced a wave of despondency in society. It facilitated the spread of the ideal of renunciation, sannyas, which, though held before society by Upanishadic Buddhist and Jain teachers, was meeting with stubborn opposition in the Hindu community. The new development affected the position of the widow adversely in many ways. It strengthened the hands of those who were opposed to niyog and widow remarriage. Both customs therefore fell gradually into disrepute. A greater calamity that overtook the widow in this period was the revival of the sati custom. In the beginning, it was confined to the warrior class. It, however, began to spread wider in society in course of time, as the action of the sati came to be regarded as a great religious sacrifice which deserved to be imitated. A school of rationalists opposed the custom vehemently, pointing out its utter futility and stupidity. Its efforts partly checked the spread of the custom for a while. The age of later Smritis, commentators, and digest writers, the only sphere in which the position of women improved in this age was the one of proprietary rights. Otherwise, she continued to lose all along the line. The right of the widow inherit the share of her husband came to be eventually recognized all over the country by AD 1200. In Bengal, the position was further improved by conceding her this right even when her husband had not separated from the joint family at the time of his death. The scope of the Istridhan was further extended by the Mitakshara school by including it in the property acquired even by inheritance and partition. The widow's estate continued to be a limited one, but in some parts of South India, she was allowed to gift it away for religious purpose without the consent of the devotioner. Property rights apart, in all other spheres, the position of women continued to deteriorate in this period. Most of the causes responsible for women's degradation during the last period continued to operate in this age also. The Upanayan of women went completely out of vogue. From the theological point of view, the woman therefore came naturally to be regarded as the same status of the Sudra. This inflicted an incalculable harm on their general status and prestige. The marriageable age of girls was lowered down still further. Towards the end of the former period, it was recommended that girls should be married just before the time of their puberty. The Upanayan of women went completely out of vogue. From the theological point of view, the woman therefore came naturally to be regarded as the same status of the Sudra. This inflicted an incalculable harm on their general status and prestige. The marriageable age of girls was lowered down still further. Towards the end of the former period, it was recommended that girls should be married just before the time of their puberty. The proper age for marriage was therefore 10 years. The age of 8, however, was regarded as the ideal one. Marriage in the case of girls corresponding to Upanayana in the case of boys. Proper age for the latter was 8. In Kshatriya families, however, girls continued to be married at about 14 or 15 years of age. Widow remarriage had become prohibited at this time. The sati custom had become common in the fighting class. In the case of non-Kshatriya girls, who were married at the age of 10 or 11, naturally no education worth the name could be imparted to them. Down to about AD 1200, daughters in rich families continued to receive some literary education through special teachers. A few of them used to distinguish themselves as poetesses down to the 10th century AD. But this tradition died down when the old aristocracy perished or declined in importance after the establishment of the Muslim rule. At the advent of the British rule, literacy among women was confined only to the class of dancing girls. Women in respectable families felt very uneasy if it was suspected that they were literate. Being generally illiterate and inexperienced, women naturally ceased to inspire respect, and the tendency to pass cynical observations about their weakness and worthlessness became more common. Down to AD 500, permission was granted to child widows to remarry, though widow remarriage in general had come to be tabooed. This permission came to be gradually withdrawn during this period. From about AD 1000, no widow in a respectable family could remarry, whatever her age might have been at the time of her husband's death. In the beginning, only widows in the higher sections of society suffered from this disability. But in the course of time, it came to be extended to the widows of those lower classes also, which were anxious to be considered respectable. The prohibition of widow remarriage came to be regarded as the most important criteria of the respectability of a class down to the beginning of the present 20th century. The tonsure of the widow came into vogue by about the 8th century AD. With the disappearance of Buddhism at this time, the prejudice against the custom gradually disappeared, and it was recommended to the widow as a kind of help and protection to her in her ascetic resolve and life. Down to about AD 800, Smritis were emphatic in declaring that women who were forcibly taken into captivity or dishonored should be admitted back to their families. Pseudo-puritanical notions distorted social vision in this matter soon after AD 1000. Hindu society began to show a surprising callousness to women, who had the misfortune of being carried away into captivity even for a very short time. From AD 1200, it refused to follow the lead of Smriti writers and declared that once a woman was converted or taken into captivity, nothing would justify her readmission to her old family and religion. This callous and unreasonable attitude had cost in Hindu society very dearly. Had the women who had been forcibly converted or captured been readmitted into Hindu society, its population would not have dwindled to 75% of the population of pre-partition India. The above survey of the position of women in Hinduism would show that their condition has been on the whole deteriorating during the last 2000 years or so. So students, now let us summarize what we have learnt in this module. According to S. Altekar, women once enjoyed considerable freedom and privileges in the spheres of family, religion and public life. But as centuries rolled on, the situation went on changing adversely. On the other hand, the proprietary rights went on gradually expanding in spite of the growing tendency to regard women as unfit for independence. According to Uma Chakravarti and other historians, since the traditional work on the status of women in India exists entirely within the context of Hinduism, it is heavily preoccupied with religious and legal questions such as the right to widow remarriage, the existence of the institution of niyog, the right to property for women, the origin and development of institution of Istridhan, and the right of the childless woman to adopt, and so on. The position of women in the Vedic age was far from being analogous to what it usually was in earlier uncivilized societies. In communities that have not yet emerged from barbarism, there hardly existed any checks on the tyranny of the man over the woman. The changes which took place during the age of the later Samhitas, Brahmanas, and Upanishads in the position of women were gradual. Their proprietary rights continued to be unrecognized, the only exception being in favor of marriage gifts of movable property. The position of women deteriorated considerably in the period of the sutras, epics, and early smritis. At the advent of the British rule, literacy among women was confined only to the class of dancing girls. Women in respectable families felt very uneasy if it was suspected that they were literate. At the advent of the British rule, literacy among women was confined only to the class of dancing girls. Women in respectable families felt very uneasy if it was suspected that they were literate. Thank you.